My name's Stewart McCulloch and I'm the CEO of Stewardship. Today I'm talking to Peter Lynas, who's the UK Director for the Evangelical Alliance and took over there in December this year. And we're going to be talking about the COVID crisis and its impact on the church. Peter, why don't we reflect on what we're seeing in the church at the moment?
Yeah, well, look, it's wonderful to be here and have this conversation. I think we've seen perhaps the most radical change in how we do church in our lifetimes. But I do think the church did an amazing job in terms of its agility and its creativity to make this happen.
You and I were doing sort of two parallel things at the same time. You ran the survey of churches where you surveyed hundreds and hundreds of churches, and we were doing what we called the Rapid Response Fund when we were seeking out churches that were providing practical help and gospel hope. And we spent a bit of time comparing notes about how the church has really moved forward at this time. What were the big takeaways for you? And then maybe I'll reflect on a few of those as well.
Got to 700 church leaders, 200 organizational leaders. So it was a pretty robust survey, and we were doing that late May, so well into lockdown. But I think a couple of things. One was the missional edge that really excited me. So, if you go to look at a hotel or you go to look at a product or you're going to buy something new, you always check it out online first. But for church, that's an incredibly hard thing to do for most churches. So there's a big step to go in the door of a church that you know nothing about, you've never seen the inside of, you've no sense of what it looks like. So suddenly everybody's online and now you can see it. So we know, church leaders were saying 70% of them had seen people checking out church who'd never been there before. Almost 60% saw an increase in people who were interested in faith. And actually just over 10% were seeing people make first-time commitments. So more people coming in the door, more people interested in faith, and then more people actually encountering Jesus for the first time. Now that's an amazing missional moment.
And I agree with you about, seekers being able to seek. One small charity that we featured once deals with sex workers in Leicester. And these people were coming to faith, but never ever got over the hurdle of actually going to a church. And a couple of weeks into lockdown, they were all attending, every single person. Suddenly the barrier had gone, and I think those people will stay because, there's a whole new set of relationships forming that have started online that perhaps can now blossom as we return to a more physical environment. Do you think there are any sort of trends kind of emerging like that?
Well, definitely one of the things that some of the other surveys out there have told us is that young people are more likely to check it out online, perhaps not that surprising, but also men. So here are the two groups the church has had a problem reaching historically, men and young people. So it's really exciting that actually they found pathways into church. And I think it will be a challenge. I'm with you. I think it's absolutely possible to bring them into the gathered environments that we're looking towards again in the future. But that's going to be a challenge. And also for churches to maintain some sort of online presence. The great temptation is we did all this stuff, got it together, and then people just want to go back to what was before. And actually we're saying, no, this was a pathway in. Church is not a closed club for those who already know Jesus. It's always got to have that missional edge. How do people come on? So I think what online has done is showing churches that maybe weren't as good at that. People do come in. There is a new pathway in, and I really want to encourage them to continue to keep those pathways open.
We've seen a lot of great charities working through churches to deliver world-class solutions. So a food bank, but not only a food bank, something that deals with fellowship, debt,
yes.
Job seeking, and other things. So you're dealing with the whole person and hopefully their soul as well, spiritually, physically, socially. And it's a very rich intervention that we're seeing emerge. And brave, to use the EA's recent branding of bolder, braver, kinder, we've seen some really powerful things. How do you see that going forward?
So great question. I think we know, again, survey, I'm not always go back to the data, but 90% almost are saying they did something to meet the needs of the vulnerable in lockdown. So the service was easy, but arguably get online, that's great. But then, as you say, they're out there meeting the needs of the vulnerable. The vast majority doing that in partnership. Great, we're a unity organisation. We're excited to see it. So that's working with other churches, other charities, but particularly with local authorities. So there's this historical hang-up. Can we work with statutory bodies and local authorities? Well, actually, almost a third were. So that's good news. Let's talk about that. And then let's also see how we get the other 2/3 into that. So that's good. And then nearly half of churches started something new. So again, great innovation. And what I don't want to see is people slipping back to the old ways and saying, let's see how we build on that innovation, that reaching out into the community in fresh and new ways. And the big things were the befriending services. So people were isolated and lonely. The WhatsApp group in the street, often people from churches taking the lead in that and saying, how can we look after those? Debt counselling. And the church leaders have said, looking ahead, it's to do with economic stuff. So particularly those who are losing jobs and the economic consequences of this moment, and mental health. Big thing church leaders are saying in response to the survey, what they see coming down the tracks is going to be mental health issues. And we get that already. We're seeing the stories around families struggling on this moment, those who are isolated and lonely, those who are losing jobs or worried about that, and then just those who are about the whole situation. We have seen a lot more talk about death, a lot more sort of sense of our own fragility and humanity in that moment. And actually, I would put it, the secular story doesn't work. The individual story, people say, I'm not an individual. I want to see people. I mean, I'm maybe not the best hugger in the world, but even I'm saying, that when am I going to get back to hug people?
Our nation is in crisis, and will beyond the health crisis is an economic crisis, and all that will bring. And there is a need for hope and recovery for an extended period. And we're kind of talking to government about what the role of the church and civil society needs to be in that environment. And the important thing being that the role of grassroots communities delivering world-class interventions. How do you see that unfolding over the next couple of years as we move into recovery?
So I think the church is really well placed. I think this is a unique moment for the church. Now, it's going to be challenging to lean into that. The church has its own problems. We know it's got some financial challenges, and we know it's going to struggle in some areas, but actually it's much better equipped than almost anybody else in this moment to lean into that space. So I'm really excited for what's potentially out there if church leaders can grab onto that and go after it. We're set for this moment. It is a unique moment in history. We've said that lots of times, and we know it. But actually, churches are really well prepared and ready. And it's a spiritual moment. I mean, we're not trying to do this in our own strength. Fundamentally, we're saying, come, Holy Spirit, be with us as we try and absolutely point people towards Jesus and do our best to build community around that.
Amen. And what a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, come, God's strength. We're after his plan, not ours. And you brought up the topic of money, which brings us on to the sort of second part of our discussion, which is we've seen statistics like charity incomes dropping by, several billion pounds in terms of all charity, but the church's share of that is very, very significant. Hundreds of millions, if not as much as £1 billion, has not come in because of cancelled events, rental income, investment income, all sorts of things have impacted the church. So therefore, how do you then reflect on where the church is in terms of its finances in order to fuel the needs ahead?
People who go to church will have church as their number one giving option. You guys know that too. I mean, this is what we found. But if you don't have money, you can't give. But overall, like churches say, they have reserves. They're not overly worried. It was simply the offering plate. So the more reliant you are on that, the more challenging it is. Just to get people to move online giving or different ways. And then those that run conferences and events, and that's a key part of their income stream, that's not coming back quickly. So that's going to be a challenge too. But overall, churches said they did have reserves. churches tend to be fairly good on their stewardship in general. I mean, there's
Yes,
not
they
without
are.
challenges again, but you know this, yeah. So that's what they do. And so they are actually ready for what's coming. And so, again, I think that's one of the challenges. The government's got no money. Civil society is really struggling. It's not that churches are sitting with loads of money, but they do have a strong asset base. They do have a strong set of volunteers, which is nearly as important as the money. So yes, a church might have limited amounts in terms of the tens of thousands of pounds, but they have hundreds of hours of volunteer time as well that they're not paying for. That's the game changer in their resource base, I would say, as well as a bit of money. And you put those two things together, and now you've got a powerful community force in a variety of areas. And then you add the Holy Spirit to that, and boom, you've got game changer, life transforming stuff going on in various communities.
Forward now, people have talked about a new normal. They've talked about all the challenges and the needs, also the acceleration of trends. I mean, certainly we were gently going online, and then I literally in a few weeks we just did it as a community, and the way it felt to me was things I thought were 5 years away suddenly were happening in days and weeks, not months and years. And we had to jump over a whole number of hurdles. But do you get a sense of this reset that's ahead? And what would you be, encouraging the church to think about in its resetting? And what would you say to people who maybe think, well, there's no reset, we're just going to go back to how it was?
Well, I think it was conversations actually with you, Stuart, your background in that disaster recovery. So there was that response phase and then the recovery phase. And often the aim there was to get back to the way things were before in a good way. That was look, this disaster has happened and we need to respond to that initially, and then we need to recover back. And I wondered in this situation, was there something slightly different? There was that, I called it the react phase. Then there's a reset opportunity in there, and there is some sort of renewal coming, and I absolutely believe in that in terms of the church. So we did the react phase. We just had to. You got online, you moved your ministries in the way you were able to deliver them. And then we're now in, I think, a reset phase, but this is, I think, the most challenging. And we have things like 4 p.m. services in the church, and you really dig around, you find out that's because that's when something else ended, or that's when the last train went. And so that was to allow people to get the bus home or whatever. And we have these things that we've been doing for 30 years, all because of a train timetable that everybody's long forgotten. So we'll be prepared to ask the more fundamental, why do we gather the way we do? Why do we do communion as often as we do? Why do we have that particular gathering? And I think that's what the reset is potentially about. But the danger is we're about to skip past it, and the drive to get back to what we had means that we miss the opportunity for a fundamental reset. And the reset always comes before renewal. And I think that's the difference. But the renewal is not guaranteed. And I think people think, well, there's going to be an amazing outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And I hope and pray there is. And that is on God's part. But if we haven't reset some stuff, we're going to miss it. We'll go back to a pastoral care model of church. It just says, I'm going to look after the 100 people in my club. That's all I'm going to do. We're just going to put the meetings back on that they want. We'll use most of our money to look after the folks already there. We'll wrap up online because all the people have come back to church now, and we're just looking after what we have, maintaining the aquarium, and nobody's going out fishing. Online and blended gets us out. The stuff we've been doing in the community took us out. We released everyone, everywhere, every day into ministry. The local became missional because we all walked our streets. We prayed for our streets. We met our neighbours again. We did all those things. And there's a danger we miss that if we don't take the reset moment. So I think there's some hard work to be done. It's tough because we're tired. If we're in church leadership, it's been a tough season, a lot of change. That's emotionally draining as well as just all the hours of effort. And we can't wait to gather, and I love that. But I do think there's some reset work to say, why do we do this? Let's keep asking the fundamental questions. Otherwise, we'll just go back to what we were before. And that was not working. Let's be honest with ourselves. In most cases, it wasn't really working. And we were struggling to get young people, we were struggling to get young males, and particularly we were struggling to get those who are hard to reach and the lost to come into our churches. So there end of my rant.
A great rant. And you mentioned I'd worked on the disasters, and I did in my last job with World Vision. I spent 5 years doing a few dozen disasters and the recovery of livelihoods after them. And one of the big concepts is build back better. If you go back to what blew away, it'll blow away again. But also there's this huge tsunami of need coming our way, but also of openness. There was this lovely survey that I think it was Tier Fund and Christian Aid or it did a survey that said, and it was for the under 18 to 35s I found most interesting, that over a third looked at some form of religious broadcast or online event during lockdown, and that's a very large number for what would have been at that point a 10 to 12 week period. I mean, how do you see those things kind of locking in and moving forward, and how do we help as leaders make that happen? What's the leadership call here?
Yeah, because I think the same thing happened in terms of disability. Churches, historic, older buildings in particular, very inaccessible. Suddenly for those with disabled kids or those with disabilities themselves, or again, shut-ins who are struggling to get out, access becomes much more significant in this way. And so they've loved aspects of online. And if we don't keep a blended version of that, we essentially shut the door again and say, well, unless you can make it into our physical building, which we acknowledge is really hard because of steps and doorways and older designs, then we're not that interested. So we absolutely have to look at ways in which we keep that blended offering.
Okay, Peter, these are interesting days, and if I'm a church leader or even more challenging, a church planter, I've got something new or that needs revitalization, and I'm sitting there with some really difficult choices. My income could be going down, could be temporary, could be quite a long time before it bounces back, and I'm wanting to go online, I'm wanting to gather, but that's difficult. I want to reach out, I want to do all of the things we've talked about. What help would you give such a leader in terms of balancing all of those forces on their ministry?
So it's a great question, and these are the tough questions that I think church leaders and trustee boards are wrestling with. So, I mean, a few things in that. I think one is, who are your group around you? It shouldn't be you on your own. We need to be listening to other voices. So we need to be listening to God, and then we need to surrounding ourselves with other people who are also doing that and bringing their wisdom into the room. I think for a church planter, it's a little different too. I mean, one of the beauties is, I think it's Andy Crouch who said, look, everyone's a startup in this moment.
Yes.
Well, church planters actually are startups. So some of us, like you are in Stewardship and EA, we're like a startup, but we've got these buildings and we've got staff. So it's not just like a startup, whereas a church planter is genuinely a startup. This is a wonderful moment to be as agile and to have a low cost base, just to be blunt, which is what a church plant has. So actually they have a lot of agility in this moment. They may not have a lot of resources, but they don't have as many risks. So I think they can actually move perhaps a little more freely and use your agility, use your low cost base if you're a planter in this moment to go and try something new and different. But most of all, what's God saying and what are the people around you saying? Don't make these decisions on their own.
I think that's great advice, Peter. I mean, this is a team game full of Christian fellowship, and you've got your congregation, you've got your trustees, you've got your leadership team. You rarely should be progressing as a Christian on your own. Almost the definition of Christian leadership is you're never on your own, which is why I like it so much. And I think that your idea of putting together your vision, your mission, being transparent about it, sharing it, testing its realism, and recent estimates, you mentioned volunteering, recent estimates have put volunteering, they put a value on it of about £3 billion a year, and compared to 2 billion of donations. That's a huge difference. It's a vast resource in comparison, and now that's a spurious total in some ways, and you can't compare one with the other. But it just shows you that we underestimate that. To underestimate it would be an error of judgment of huge proportions. And so the sheer resource of the church gathering around this, and whilst certain parts of our our income might be smaller, we can always use it more wisely, and then go forward carefully as we move into this new normal. Peter, we've covered a lot of ground, and I just want to add one more question on church planting, which has been a growing part of church life for some years, and some considerable years, and goes through cycles. But in this cycle of a major health crisis and an economic crisis ahead, what would you say if somebody's feeling called to be a church planter but is slightly nervous, or had just started church planting and is struggling and is worried about the time ahead? What would you say to them?
So again, I mean, I think really understandable questions. And I think the first question is, what is God saying, as you've said there with the call piece? Like, what's God saying in this moment? And it's a real disruptive moment. And in a way, church planting is a disruptive thing. And so I generally am going, yes, what better moment in a sense for that kind of innovation coming onto the scene? This is the most missional moment that I can think of. And it's that time for innovation. And for the agility that a church planter has in that moment.
Yeah, great answer. I mean, Stewardship, as you probably know, we support 3,000 people who are either trainees, mission workers, or indeed people on that journey to church planting at the early stages where they've taken that leap of faith, and then we support them all the way along to forming a charity, buying a building, employing staff, and all those other things.
It's going to be cheap accommodation. Just when you were saying about buying a building, I thought it's going to be so much potential office space available to meet in a church. Suddenly you've got these. It's sad. There's going to be businesses changing, and they're not going to need their buildings in the same way. So suddenly you've got a chance to go into a community, perhaps pick up a building on the cheap. You've been able to build something online. This is the moment for the entrepreneur within the gifting of the church to come forward, and the church planter is the entrepreneur, and we need those people more than ever. So actually I think there's fantastic opportunities to rethink the way we're going to do things, rethink how you get a building, put an online service on the cheap, but actually do something amazing and different in terms of something maybe innovative, social enterprise, bringing jobs and employment in that space, and looking at how you can do that. And that's always, suddenly that plant's going to fly in a whole different way. But the church planters are essentially our entrepreneurs in the church world, and we need them more than ever.
And I think from Stewardship's point of view, we see there's two things that we can do. We're like the core of logistics to the army that will march. In terms of what our job is really to try to provide resources or to enable resources to get to the front line, and then to help the front line use those resources well. And we intend to redouble our efforts to be focused on the church and getting those resources to the church and get them looked after well in order that the army then moves. And I think the Evangelical Alliance and others are then preparing the army for a new positive action in its phase. I think to a certain, we've been through a season, I would argue, of a slight negativity and defensiveness. Do you see a season change in the role of church in society and being more positive?
Yes. I mean, I think the unity thing comes out first. I mean, that's core to us and the Evangelical Alliance. It's funny, we were saying sometimes because of the breadth of what we do, the elevator pitch is hard, but I'm not even asked to give the elevator pitch. Many people are like, we know why he is. We want church unity. Help us get together with other churches to learn from them in this moment. But we're also deeply passionate about the mission piece, and we're seeing churches being more missional, and that everyone is local and everything's become more missional. And then the voice piece, I think you're right. I mean, we talked about the braver, kinder, and that's something that's core to us at Evangelical Alliance. Some of the cultural war debates are drifting to the side. They become less relevant. This moment, people are like, well, it's about survival now. It's about more core things. We're not going to argue about some of these things that now seem a bit peripheral, seem a bit self-indulgent about the individual and their rights and lots of different things.
I remember a story from a church in Cambridge during the height of this crisis where they delivered a surprise, or unexpected, is a better word, food parcel to an elderly man who was living on his own. And he was so hungry, he just ate it in front of them there and then. And that's the church. It's deep local care, and then that moves forward into not being isolated, and the fellowship and the soul and the eternal hope that only the church can bring at any time, but might be revealed in this backdrop, I think, a little better than most. I just wondered, slightly putting you on the spot, is there any last thing you'd like to sort of say that would sum up your hope and prayer for the church at this time?
Yeah, I think the hope piece that you said is absolutely critical. And the danger is this is at least a two-stage crisis. Stage one is over, if you like, and we go back to church and then kind of let stage two run its course almost independent of us. That's the financial and the economic and lots of other things. I mean, this is family breakdown. This is isolation. This is a lack of services. This is people not getting needs met. This could be really, really dire. I don't want to be a prophet of doom. I'm not inclined to that by any stretch. But I think it's naive not to think this is going to be really bad. But the church navigates stage one and then just get back together and think, well, we're fine now. And this other crisis just goes along by the side and we miss it entirely. That is a huge moment for us to speak of the hope. And I don't mean just a blasé general hope. I mean a hope backed by faith in Jesus Christ. That's who's changed my life. That's who's changed your life. Yeah. Let's not be shy about this. Let's not pretend there's some wonderful, we're just coming to help you out of your debt. We're just coming to bring you food. We're doing that because Jesus changed our lives, and I want Jesus to change your life. I'll give you food regardless. I will help you with your debt, whether you're interested or not. But I really hope you get this, because I can't live without him, and I don't think you can. But I'm going to keep coming and keep serving you and keep talking about the Jesus who's wrecked my life in a wonderful way, turned it not upside down, but right side up. And that's the hope we absolutely have to bring. So we're not talking about a social gospel without the gospel. We're absolutely talking about the gospel, which has a social implication, which is massive, but it's still absolutely around Jesus transforming our lives. And that's what's wonderfully wrecked our lives, and that's what the church needs to be sharing.
Amen. Thank you, Peter. You are an inspiration to us all. It's been a real pleasure to work with you through this crisis, and to on bring a vision I hope we share to the government and hopefully to the wider church. And thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.